Lydia Marlowe stood at the edge of her driveway, holding a steaming mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Sycamore Ridge, the kind of place where every blade of grass was measured, every porch light matched, and everyone knew everyone, or, at the very least, knew who didn't belong. She had only moved in 3 months ago, into the 2-story house her late brother left her in his will. A quiet neighborhood, a modest home, and the illusion of peace. These were all things Lydia had believed she was inheriting. At 58, after a career in real estate appraisal and a recent series of emotionally draining relocations for clients battling property disputes, Lydia had looked forward to something simple, something rooted, something hers. She hadn't unpacked every box yet. In fact, she hadn't even touched the upstairs guest room since moving in, and the garage still looked more like a storage unit than a place to park her car. But the living room was livable, and the kitchen gave her a small sense of pride every time she cooked for herself, alone, with the kind of quiet satisfaction only someone who'd lived too long in chaos could appreciate. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and it was finally enough. Her son, Nick, visited when he could. He was in his early 30s, a deputy sheriff working the northern quadrant of the county, and one of the few people she trusted without question. Their relationship was close in a quiet, unspoken way. They didn't talk every day, but when they did, the conversation always picked up where it left off. Nick was the kind of man who said little but meant every word. He had suggested she move to Sycamore Ridge in the first place, citing its low crime, stable property values, and well-maintained streets. They've got their own committee, he had said offhandedly. Keeps the place tight. She'd nodded at the time, not fully understanding what that meant. She understood now. The first month passed without incident, and Lydia had begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could ease into this new chapter without resistance. She went for walks, offered nods to strangers at the mailbox, and even exchanged a few pleasant, if forgettable words with the neighbor across the street. A man named Joel who always seemed to be repainting something on his porch. No one warned her about Karen Bradley. The name didn't appear in the welcome packet. No one had mentioned her during the brief visit from the block's hospitality representative. But it didn't take long for Lydia to notice the woman who seemed to appear in every window, at every curb, always watching, always waiting. Karen was the unofficial mouthpiece of the neighborhood committee. She wasn't elected, but she didn't need to be. Her influence was woven into the fabric of Sycamore Ridge like mildew behind fresh paint. She walked the streets as if they belonged to her, clutching a folder full of forms and warnings, greeting residents with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. The first interaction Lydia had with her was almost laughable in retrospect, a casual comment during a walk. "Your recycling bins were out past the allowed hour last Tuesday. I know you're still adjusting, so I didn't report it." Lydia had thanked her, confused. The bins hadn't been out at all, but she let it go. The second incident wasn't so easy to ignore. Her garage was undergoing some light repairs. Her brother had let the concrete floor crack and shift over the years, and the contractor needed full access to tear it up and repour. For 3 days, Lydia parked her car in the street outside her own home, angled carefully, not blocking anyone's driveway, well within the posted municipal guidelines. There were no signs indicating restrictions. No red curbs. Just a quiet suburban road and a car that happened to be parked in front of the wrong house. Hers. On the 4th morning, she opened her front door and found a letter pressed into her mailbox. Unsealed, unsigned, but unmistakably intentional. It was printed, not handwritten, using a generic municipal template, and it began with the words, "Notice of informal violation." Her vehicle, it claimed, had been positioned in a way that may impede pedestrian sightlines and was in potential breach of residential frontage harmony. Lydia stared at the paper for a long moment, trying to process what she was reading. There was no ordinance number, no contact information. Just the vague language of power poorly disguised as concern. Attached to the letter was a printed photo, grainy, taken from an upper floor window, zoomed in just enough to make her car's license plate visible. Her name wasn't mentioned anywhere, but the implication was crystal clear. Someone had photographed her vehicle and submitted a complaint to the committee. Someone had chosen to escalate what was, at worst, a non-issue into something formal, something meant to intimidate. She didn't need to ask around to figure out who that someone was. Karen lived 2 houses down, in a gray colonial with lace curtains that never seemed to move. That same afternoon, Lydia watched from her window as Karen stepped out in her usual outfit. Beige cardigan, clipboard, faux casual posture, and approached a neighbor across the street. They chatted briefly, then Karen gestured toward Lydia's property. It wasn't confrontational, it was worse. It was casual, like gossip dressed up as duty. Lydia didn't confront her, that wasn't her style, but she did take a photo of the letter and the attached image, sent them to Nick with a single message. Neighborhood's got eyes. His reply was short. Don't respond, just observe. Document everything. That night, Lydia moved her car back into the driveway. Not because she was intimidated, but because she understood the type of person she was dealing with now. This wasn't about parking. This was about control. And control didn't come from authority in places like Sycamore Ridge. It came from suggestion, implication, the illusion of a shared understanding that was never truly agreed upon. She began to notice the small things, conversations that paused as she approached. Neighbors who once offered weak smiles now pretending not to see her. Her mail started arriving later in the day, sometimes crammed awkwardly into the box. A package went missing, not a big one, just a book she'd ordered. But it was the timing that stung. 2 days after she ignored a second notice about acceptable yard maintenance. It was the first time in years that Lydia felt like an outsider in a place she was supposed to call home. But she didn't panic. She didn't lash out. She did what she'd done her entire life. She paid attention. She tracked the patterns. She watched how people shifted, who moved in Karen's orbit, who drifted farther from it. She wasn't here to fight a war over grass height or wheel placement, but she also wasn't about to be silently pushed out by someone who believed leadership was just another word for dominion. What Lydia didn't know, what Karen could never have anticipated, was that the quiet woman with the appraiser's instinct and the calm demeanor had a resource no amount of gossip or pressure could counter: a direct line to the local sheriff's office. And when Karen decided to escalate things further, when she decided to report Lydia not just through committee channels, but through the county's own enforcement system, she had no way of knowing who would be the one to show up at her door. But that moment was still to come. For now, Lydia simply folded the letter, slid it into a file folder labeled Correspondence Ridge, and placed it carefully in the second drawer of her desk. She didn't know what game Karen was playing, not fully, but she understood this. She wasn't going to play it by Karen's rules. Not now, not ever. 3 days passed before the second letter arrived, and by then, Lydia had convinced herself that perhaps she had overestimated Karen's intentions. Not underestimated, never that. But maybe, just maybe, she had let the tension build too quickly, allowed her past experiences to color the present more than they should. The neighborhood, for all its flaws, was still new to her. She was still adjusting. It wouldn't be entirely unreasonable if a few residents were watching closely, cautious about someone unfamiliar occupying the Marlowe property, especially someone who kept to herself and didn't bake cookies for the block. She found the envelope folded, not inside the mailbox, but wedged beneath the welcome mat, just enough of it sticking out to ensure it would be seen. This one bore no official formatting, no pretense of formality. It was handwritten, small, exacting cursive, the kind of penmanship that suggested either control or instability. And Lydia had a strong suspicion which one it was. The note was brief, unsigned, and purposefully vague. Some of us care about the safety of this street. Visibility matters. A parked car, even for just a few hours, can cost someone their life. We hope this doesn't become a pattern. She read it twice, then again, the phrasing sinking like silt in her stomach. It wasn't a threat, not technically. It was a statement, one that relied on ambiguity to deliver pressure. There was no accusation, but there was judgment, subtle, quiet, and unmistakable. The use of we instead of I was the oldest intimidation tactic in the book. Imply a collective where none exists. Suddenly, Lydia's isolated tension transformed into something heavier. Someone, or multiple someones, had decided to categorize her as a problem. Whether or not others agreed didn't matter. The seed had been planted. Still, she didn't react. Instead, she photographed the letter, just as she had the previous one. and emailed both images to Nick, who responded with the same tone as before. Understood. Continue logging. There was no dramatic reaction, no promise to storm into the neighborhood and confront anyone. That wasn't who Nick was, and it wasn't what Lydia wanted. She didn't need a hero. She needed clarity. The true catalyst came later that same afternoon. Lydia had left her home for a short errand run, groceries, prescriptions, and a stop at the post office, and returned to find a black SUV idling across from her driveway. The driver, a woman in her mid-50s, wore large sunglasses and held a phone in her hand, pointed vaguely in Lydia's direction. As soon as Lydia pulled in, the woman drove off, slowly, but with just enough deliberateness to make her presence feel intentional. Later that evening, after dinner, Lydia decided to take a walk. She brought a flashlight, not because it was dark, street lamps lit every corner of Sycamore Ridge, but because it gave her hands something to do. She made her way along the perimeter of the neighborhood. Not rushed, not anxious, just thinking. And that's when she noticed the small group of neighbors standing in front of Karen's house. It wasn't a formal gathering, no chairs, no agenda, just a cluster of people, mid-conversation, laughing too tightly, sipping wine from plastic cups, nodding at whatever Karen was saying. She wasn't close enough to hear, and she didn't try to get closer. What caught her eye wasn't the gathering, but what was behind Karen, on her porch. A corkboard mounted against the wall, angled slightly, but visible enough to make out rows of pinned notes. They were too small to read from the street, but one stood out. A printed image of a car, zoomed in on the license plate. Her license plate? Lydia didn't stop walking. She didn't even change her pace. But her stomach twisted with cold clarity. That board was no coincidence. That photograph wasn't archival or decorative. It was evidence of obsession, of a need to document and control. And Karen wasn't just keeping tabs on her, she was broadcasting it. The next morning, the tone of the situation shifted from unnerving to overt. Lydia received an official envelope from the Community Neighborhood Committee, hand-delivered by a teenager on a bicycle who didn't even make eye contact when he handed it to her. The letter was formatted in crisp black and white, header embossed with the committee's seal, the kind of formatting that was meant to look governmental but wasn't. The contents were more aggressive than the first notice. A formal citation for parking in violation of neighborhood regulation, 3B, subsection 2, concerning prolonged street parking exceeding 48 hours within non-designated zones. Lydia read it once, then again, before checking her calendar. Her car hadn't been on the street more than 36 hours, and only because of garage repairs. The citation included a fine payable within 10 business days and a vague reference to further action should non-compliance occur. Attached was a printed copy of the same photograph she had seen on Karen's corkboard. She didn't respond. Not immediately. Instead, she called the city's parking enforcement office. Not the neighborhood committee, not Karen, not anyone in Sycamore Ridge, and inquired whether the local municipal code aligned with such a citation. The woman on the other end of the line was polite but firm. Street parking is allowed unless otherwise posted. If your neighborhood has private bylaws, they're not enforceable by the city. We don't recognize private fines. With that information in hand, Lydia printed the email the city representative sent her as confirmation, filed it neatly into her correspondence folder, and drafted her own letter addressed to the committee, clearly stating her intention to dispute the citation on the grounds of legal jurisdiction and factual inaccuracy. She hand-delivered the letter to the drop box at the community center the next day, not because she expected a fair review, but because she wanted it on record. She wanted Karen to know that this wasn't going to be easy. That afternoon, her garbage bins were tipped over. Nothing stolen, nothing broken. Just upended, with the contents splayed across the curb. Again, not dramatic, just disruptive. A nuisance meant to frustrate, not destroy. She cleaned it up without comment, but her thoughts were already racing. This wasn't just about cars anymore, this was a test. And someone was watching to see how she would react. What Karen didn't realize was that Lydia had spent 30 years navigating volatile markets, irate clients, bad faith realtors, and crooked zoning officers. She knew how to smile while being manipulated. She knew how to pretend to agree long enough to walk away with the upper hand. Most importantly, she knew how to gather documentation without giving anything away. Nick called that night, his voice calm, measured as always. He had looked into Karen Bradley after receiving Lydia's earlier messages. Nothing illegal, nothing unusual. But her name did pop up more often than others in the committee's internal minutes. She likes to take the lead, he said. Usually doesn't like being told no. Lydia paused before responding. She's trying to build something. A version of this neighborhood that only works if people like me don't exist. Nick didn't argue. He didn't tell her to stay quiet, or to confront Karen, or to back down. Instead, he said the one thing that truly mattered. I'm paying attention now, and so is the department. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a promise of intervention. But it was enough. Because Lydia had spent her entire life preparing to deal with problems just like Karen. She just hadn't expected to find one in her own front yard. The next week in Sycamore Ridge began with sunshine and the scent of mowed grass, the kind of deceptive calm that cloaks a place preparing to boil over. Lydia had started keeping a legal pad on her kitchen counter, not because she expected to need it, but because she wanted to be ready when something tipped. She had filled a few pages already, dates, times, descriptions of petty incidents, annotated copies of letters and envelopes, notes about who had spoken to whom and when. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Because when someone like Karen Bradley decided you didn't belong, it wasn't enough for her to say so. She needed to orchestrate it, layer it in systems until it looked like a verdict rather than a vendetta. Lydia had never asked for a fight, but she also wasn't going to fold. By the third Monday of the month, a new notice was posted. This one tacked to the community bulletin board near the park, which meant it was visible to every passing dog walker, stroller pusher, and jogger, pretending not to stop and stare. The notice was presented as a revised procedural clarification regarding street use, including a new clause about temporary obstructions that compromise community harmony. The language was vague enough to be dismissed as routine, but specific, enough to carry intent. The clause referenced a pending vote, a scheduled meeting, and a proposal to empower enforcement pathways for the well-being of all residents. It was bureaucratic poison. No one outside of Karen's circle would know what it meant, but anyone watching closely would understand who it was aimed at. Lydia stood in front of the board for a full minute, reading and rereading the wording, memorizing its careful weaponization. A woman she had never seen before paused behind her, pretending to check another flyer, then muttered just loud enough for Lydia to hear. Some people just can't follow rules. Then she walked away, not waiting for a reply. Lydia didn't flinch. She didn't turn around. She simply pulled out her phone, took a photo of the notice, and walked home in silence. That night, she received an email, not from the committee directly, but from a general neighborhood listserv she hadn't even realized she was part of. The email was framed as a community survey, asking residents to share their thoughts on recent disruptions, street congestion, and behavioral standards for shared spaces. There were no names mentioned, but the language was unmistakably pointed. One question asked, "Do you believe individuals should be allowed to exploit policy loopholes for personal convenience?" Another offered options for what penalties should be imposed for repeated, non-harmonious conduct. Lydia stared at the screen, her jaw tightening as the realization took hold. Karen wasn't just trying to punish her. She was building a case for exile through consensus. She wanted Lydia voted out by implication. The escalation was deliberate, methodical. Over the next few days, Lydia's mailbox began to fill with pamphlets. Some official-looking, others amateurish but focused. Topics range from protecting your neighborhood to the silent risks of noncompliance. One included a checklist titled, "How to Spot Disruptive Patterns." Lydia flipped through them without emotion, stacking them neatly beside her coffee maker. She didn't shred them. She didn't throw them away. Everything was evidence now. Then, on Thursday, the garbage incident happened again. This time, not just her bins overturned, but a thin trail of trash stretched across her driveway. As if someone had kicked through the contents deliberately. She found a used tissue tucked beneath her windshield wiper, along with a handwritten note on a scrap of envelope. "Still think rules don't apply to you?" It wasn't signed, but the slanted, tight handwriting matched the previous unmarked letter she had received. Lydia didn't even hesitate. She photographed the scene from every angle, cleaned the mess with quiet efficiency, and filed a formal complaint. Not with the committee, but with the county sanitation office. Her rationale was simple and unprovocative. Unauthorized tampering with waste containers is a minor civil violation. She didn't expect immediate action, but again, it was about record keeping. Patterns, paper trails. The following Saturday marked the monthly community meeting. Lydia debated whether to attend. Part of her wanted to stay home, to avoid the stage-managed spectacle she knew Karen would create. But in the end, she decided to go, not to defend herself, but to listen. To see who showed up, who spoke, who stayed silent. Information, after all, was power. The meeting was held in the modest clubhouse near the southern entrance of the neighborhood. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and folding chairs lined the room in stiff, orderly rows. Lydia arrived early enough to choose a seat along the wall, away from the center but close enough to hear. Karen entered shortly afterward, flanked by 2 committee members and carrying a stack of folders like a prosecutor entering court. She scanned the room once and saw Lydia. Her lips twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite a frown. Just acknowledgement. The meeting began with pleasantries, minor updates about landscaping budgets and pest control services, then shifted abruptly. Karen stood and introduced the next item as a matter of collective interest, presenting it as a proposal to redefine community standards for street use. She used phrases like consistent offender, habitual resistance to neighborly requests, and documented disregard for cohesion. She never once said Lydia's name, but every eye turned toward her anyway. The implication was complete. Karen's tone was measured, her voice the kind of practiced diplomacy one might hear from a suburban autocrat. Firm but faux-friendly, confident in her control of the room. When she opened the floor for comments, Lydia remained seated, silent. She didn't raise her hand, she didn't argue. Instead, a man across the room, an older gentleman named Richard, who had once waved to Lydia while pruning his rose bushes, stood up and said, "I'm not comfortable with targeting a single resident under the guise of general policy." His voice wasn't angry, just flat, factual. The moment hung in the air. Karen thanked him without addressing the substance of his comment, then moved on. Another neighbor, quieter, offered a similarly cautious remark about avoiding overreach. Karen nodded, shifted the agenda, and kept going, but the spell was cracked. Not broken, but weakened. After the meeting, Karen approached Lydia near the exit. Her smile was tight, controlled. "I hope you don't feel attacked," she said, voice silky. "This is all for the benefit of the neighborhood." Lydia returned the smile, cool and calm. "Then I'm sure you'll understand when I request a full transcript of the meeting minutes and a copy of the vote breakdown." Karen's smile froze just slightly, her posture stiffening. "Of course," she said before walking away. By Sunday, an anonymous flyer was taped to Lydia's door. It wasn't threatening, just strange. An image of a car parked on a suburban street. Beneath it, the words, "Some homes don't adapt, they resist." There was no name, no logo, no direct accusation, but it didn't have to be. Lydia stood there, holding it in one hand, a slow breath rising in her chest. She wasn't angry, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. The moment that shifted the conflict from pressure to outright confrontation came not with a bang, but with something quieter, colder. A technicality masked as an accusation. An ordinary knock on the door delivered with the sharp cadence of official intention. It was early on a Tuesday morning, the sun not yet fully risen above the rooftops, when Lydia heard the sound. Not frantic, not aggressive, just precise. When she opened the door, there were 2 men standing at the base of her steps, one holding a tablet, the other a clipboard. They were not in uniform, but their demeanor was bureaucratic enough to carry weight. The man with the clipboard introduced himself as Aaron, from the Neighborhood Regulatory Coordination Office, a local compliance liaison working with residential associations to ensure structural harmony. The other remained silent but watchful. The reason for their visit, Aaron explained, was a formal inspection request initiated by the Sycamore Ridge Committee regarding possible modifications and non-conforming enhancements to driveway access. a phrase Lydia had never heard in her life. She stood quietly, letting him finish, not reacting outwardly. When he asked if he could observe the layout, she replied with a firm but polite request for documentation outlining the complaint. He produced a digital record with 2 photographs. One of her driveway from a wide angle and another, far more invasive, taken from an upper floor, almost certainly from Karen's property, zoomed directly onto the seam between the driveway concrete and the sidewalk. It was a photo that didn't suggest danger, it suggested obsession. Lydia didn't fight. She didn't block the inspection. She stood back, arms crossed lightly, and let the 2 men walk the perimeter. Aaron took a few more photos, made a few notes, then left with a vague remark about likely being within limits but needing to file. She watched them leave and only closed the door when they were entirely out of sight. Then she went to her desk and logged the time, names, and sequence of events. By that afternoon, the incident had reached Nick. He called, his voice as flat as ever but edged with something new. Disbelief. He'd run the complaint through unofficial channels and confirmed the source. Karen had submitted a request for inspection under her name, citing community concern and potential trip hazard. He didn't tell Lydia to escalate. He didn't tell her to stand down either. But he asked more carefully than usual if she wanted him to come by in uniform or off-duty. She told him not yet. She was still measuring the shape of the battlefield. What happened next wasn't an accident. It was a pivot. Karen shifted tactics, no longer relying on committee-wide proclamations, but instead pursuing a whisper campaign, a web of quiet nudges and offhand remarks. Lydia learned this the hard way through a conversation with a neighbor named Judith, who approached her while watering roses in her front yard. The chat started simply enough: weather, plants, spring schedules. But somewhere in the middle, Judith asked too casually, "So you really didn't get a permit when you had the garage repaired?" Lydia froze, then turned her head slowly, calmly. "Of course I did. I have the permit in my file cabinet." Judith blinked, surprised at the directness. "Oh, well, Karen mentioned there might have been some confusion. Something about retroactive compliance?" Her tone said everything else. She wasn't accusing Lydia. She was warning her. Lydia smiled, thanked her, and went inside. And then she did the most useful thing she'd done in weeks. She called her attorney. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No lawsuits, no cease and desist. But it was a deliberate signal. She wasn't handling this alone anymore. Her lawyer, a sharp retired city code analyst named Eleanor Finch, listened carefully, asked for scanned copies of all documents and correspondence, and offered her a plan, not to sue, not to threaten, but to request a procedural audit of the committee's actions via municipal governance review. Lydia didn't fully understand the legal mechanics, but the term administrative pressure was used, and she trusted it enough. The paperwork was filed within 48 hours, an official request for the minutes of all committee meetings involving property citations over the last 6 months, a petition for itemized documentation of all fines issued, a demand for the identity and credentials of the compliance liaison who visited Lydia's home. Lydia didn't need immediate answers. She just needed the machinery to start grinding. And it did. Within a few days, a very different energy began to settle over the neighborhood. Lydia noticed it first in the silences. The looks from people who had previously avoided her gaze now lingered just long enough to suggest a shift. No one said anything openly, but there was an absence of the usual tension. Something had fractured, not loudly, but meaningfully. Karen hadn't disappeared. If anything, she seemed to double down, appearing more frequently at the park, organizing another flyer drop, sending out another email labeled "a message from your neighbors." But the tone had changed. It was more careful now, threaded with defensiveness. One evening, just before sunset, Lydia saw her across the street talking to a small group, animated, gesturing toward Lydia's home. But when one of the women shook her head and walked away, Lydia felt something click. The tide wasn't turning entirely, but it was shifting enough to create space. Space to breathe, to move, to counter. That night, Nick stopped by, not in uniform, not to confront anyone, just to sit with his mother on the back porch. He brought takeout, and they ate quietly while the sound of lawn sprinklers echoed faintly in the distance. After a while, Lydia looked at him and asked, "How do you know when something isn't just annoying, but dangerous?" Nick didn't answer immediately. He took a sip from his drink, then leaned back in his chair. "When it stops being about the thing they say it's about," he replied. "When it becomes about how much they need you gone, no matter the excuse." Lydia nodded once and said, "I think we've passed that point." And Nick said, "Then maybe it's time I showed up the next time she calls." It wasn't said with anger. There was no threat in his tone. Just a simple, factual acceptance of the weight his presence could carry. And for the first time since the first letter, Lydia allowed herself to hope. Not that it would end quickly. Not that Karen would back down, but that she wouldn't have to carry the whole burden alone anymore. And that was enough for now. It began fittingly with silence. Not the kind that settles over a room when people run out of things to say, but the kind that is manufactured, curated, and distributed like a weapon. Lydia first noticed it at the post office of all places, when a neighbor she had spoken with dozens of times before, a woman named Carol who always commented on the scent of seasonal stamps, pretended not to see her, not merely distracted, but deliberately unseeing. Her posture stiffened, her shoulders pulled tight, and when Lydia stepped into line behind her, Carol stepped out of it, feigning interest in a display of shipping tape. It was small, forgettable, but unmistakable. By the end of that week, there were more. A man who used to wave from his front steps now shifted behind his hedges when Lydia walked past. A teenager who once asked to borrow her garden hose crossed the street to avoid passing her driveway. None of it was confrontational. None of it was loud. But the pattern was real, and patterns were what Lydia understood best. The informational requests her lawyer submitted began returning results. Some incomplete, others delayed, most wrapped in vague bureaucratic phrasing. But what emerged from them was a troubling mosaic. Karen had not only submitted more complaints than any other resident in the past year, but she had done so under multiple pretexts, varying the language just enough each time to circumvent internal thresholds for harassment. She didn't accuse the same person twice in the same way. She staggered citations, adjusted timing, altered her tone. It was methodical and strategic. More than that, it was deliberate. Lydia wasn't the first person Karen had targeted, but she might be the first who didn't back away. And so the escalation changed forms. It started with a vote. One Lydia hadn't been invited to attend. A special session, held under the guise of an emergency procedural update, called with less than 24 hours' notice and convened in Karen's own living room. Official meeting minutes listed only 3 attendees besides Karen, all of whom had signed off on a new clause. Subsection 3B17, now clarified to include historical behavioral assessment as a factor in evaluating resident compliance. The language was vague enough to elude outright dismissal, but specific enough to target. In short, it allowed the committee to reevaluate past incidents and retroactively assign cumulative weight, thereby increasing the severity of response, even when previous matters had been resolved. Lydia received a notice the following day informing her that due to this clause, her pattern of disregard now qualified her for an internal review. The review, according to the document, could include fines, suspension of privileges, and, in rare cases, recommendation for external arbitration. Lydia sat with the letter for a full hour before responding, not by writing back, not by calling Karen, but by calling her lawyer and asking a single question. What constitutes actionable defamation in a residential setting? The answer was long, detailed, and frustratingly dependent on context, but Finch did suggest a clear next move. Request that all further correspondence be delivered through counsel. Lydia composed the formal notification that afternoon and dropped it in the committee's Dropbox with a quiet weight of finality. She had decided no more direct engagement, no more participation in Karen's carefully staged provocations. The fallout was immediate. The following week, a community-wide flyer was circulated, unofficial in tone but polished in design. It bore no logos, no names, but its headline read, "Understanding Passive Threats in Our Neighborhood." It contained a series of scenarios, vague, abstract, hypotheticals according to Karen, but one example stood out. A resident who consistently challenges neighborhood norms while refusing to participate in dialogue may pose an implicit risk to the collective well-being. It didn't name Lydia. It didn't have to. By then, the pattern had been cemented in the minds of anyone who wanted an excuse to look away. For those who didn't, the implication alone was enough to create uncertainty. Nick came by again 2 days later. This time he didn't bring dinner. He brought a copy of an internal call log. Karen had called the sheriff's department with a formal complaint. Unfounded, vague, a concern about ongoing vehicular activity around Lydia's home that made her feel unsafe. The dispatcher had logged it as a non-urgent residential welfare check. Nick, reading the report, had shaken his head. "She's laying groundwork," he said, trying to bait a response. Lydia only nodded. She didn't need confirmation. She already knew. Then came the real turn, the moment where silence became spectacle. Karen reported Lydia again, but this time directly to the sheriff's department, bypassing all neighborhood channels, claiming Lydia had parked in a way that obstructed access to fire hydrants, emergency lanes, and posed a documented risk to emergency personnel. The report was flagged for urgent dispatch. A patrol unit was sent. And by sheer coincidence, or perhaps fate, Nick was on rotation. Lydia didn't know he was coming. When she saw the cruiser roll up, she stepped out calmly, assuming protocol, ready to explain. Then she saw her son's face behind the windshield. He got out, kept it professional, approached the walkway. Karen was already on her porch, watching, arms folded, lips tight. Nick walked up the path, expression unreadable. He spoke in his usual even cadence. "We got a call about vehicle obstruction. Want to walk me through it?" Lydia said nothing for a second, then nodded toward the car in her driveway. "Been there since yesterday. I had groceries delivered. That's all." Karen interjected from the edge of her property. "It's about the history, officer. We've had a pattern. Disregard, resistance, intentional blocking. That car has been parked inconsistently for weeks now. We've documented it. The committee's already moved for review." Nick turned to her slowly. "Ma'am, I'm not here on behalf of your committee. I'm here on a civil complaint filed with the county. My role is to determine whether there's a violation of any enforceable law. And based on what I see right now, there isn't." Karen blinked. "But you're her son." Nick didn't flinch. "And I'm also the responding officer." The silence was sharp enough to cut pavement. Karen stared at him, as if calculating whether to push further, then turned abruptly and went back inside. Lydia didn't speak. She didn't smile. She didn't react at all until Nick turned back to her and said quietly, "You're good. Let me know if she keeps this up." And then he left, and the cruiser rolled out of view, and the sun set on a neighborhood that had been watching through their blinds. What followed was the unraveling, not quick, not explosive, but steady, inevitable. Several residents who had previously avoided Lydia began to reappear. Polite nods at first, then brief exchanges at the mailbox, then comments like, "She's intense, huh?" Or, "Don't know how you've dealt with this for so long." Lydia didn't respond, with bitterness. She just listened. She let them come to their own conclusions. Karen, sensing the shift, doubled down. New flyers, new warnings, a bulletin board outside her house with laminated notices about standards. But her grip was slipping, and she knew it. A neighbor down the block filed a grievance against her for harassment. Another requested a full audit of committee voting procedures. The request Lydia's lawyer had initiated now had momentum. Momentum Karen could no longer control. Lydia remained calm, unmoving. She didn't revel in the shift. She didn't gloat. But she did allow herself one change. She began parking her car wherever it made sense. Not in defiance, not as a statement, just practically like anyone else. And for the first time in months, no one said a word. Lydia knew the tipping point was coming, though she couldn't predict its exact shape. Only that something irreversible would eventually snap. Karen's efforts had begun to backfire, not with grand revolts or confrontations, but in quieter, more telling ways. The fabric she'd tightly woven from gossip, insinuation, and veiled threats had begun to fray at the seams. Not because Lydia fought it with fury, but because she didn't. Her silence, her poise, her refusal to respond emotionally had destabilized Karen's grip more than any open challenge could have. But the pressure had built for too long, and the moment for quiet tension was ending. Something had to give. It began with a formal letter, delivered not to Lydia this time, but to every resident of Sycamore Ridge. The committee, under Karen's guidance, announced an emergency policy clarification set to be voted on within 72 hours. The subject: repeated behavioral deviation from community standards. The proposal argued that persistent minor infractions could be grounds for restricted access to communal services, including suspension from decision-making meetings and revocation of non-essential community privileges. It was a coded declaration of war. Everyone knew who it was aimed at, and Lydia was no longer the only one who recognized it. The letter was legal in appearance, but not in structure. No legal citations, no city endorsements, no procedural support. Just the signature of Karen Bradley and a handful of committee members, whose names, until now, had been anonymous to most residents. For some, it was just another document they skimmed before tossing. For others, it was the final straw. By the end of the first day, several residents had posted to the neighborhood's internal online forum, a space rarely used except for lost dog alerts and furniture giveaways. But this time, the posts had a new tone: firm, uneasy, direct. One resident wrote, "Since when do we strip people of rights based on personality differences?" Another posted, "Anyone else getting tired of being told what's acceptable behavior by someone who treats the neighborhood like her property?" For Lydia, it was a signal. Not that she was winning, but that people were finally willing to speak without fear of being isolated. Still, she didn't speak herself. She didn't write. She didn't post. Instead, she prepared. Her lawyer had already begun compiling everything: flyers, notices, printed emails, informal citations. And when the vote was scheduled, Lydia submitted a formal request to be present with representation. It wasn't necessary by rule, but it was lawful, and it was unexpected. Karen had counted on inertia, on Lydia's reluctance to engage directly. She had not expected legal formality. The vote was set to occur in the community center, a low building with fluorescent lights that had seen years of potlucks and town halls, now suddenly elevated into a battlefield. Lydia arrived with Eleanor Finch beside her, who carried a slim leather binder and a presence far larger than her 5-foot frame. Karen was already inside, flanked by her usual committee allies and dressed as if for a campaign rally. Pressed blazer, pearl necklace, a stack of papers meant to look important. The room filled quickly. Lydia was surprised by how many chairs were taken, how few backs were turned to her when she entered. She took a seat in the second row, close enough to hear but not to command attention. Eleanor sat beside her, flipping through her binder calmly, occasionally glancing up like a seasoned trial attorney preparing to dismantle a faulty witness. Karen opened the meeting with her usual air of condescension masked as charm. She welcomed everyone, spoke about community values, and framed the policy proposal as a necessary evolution of collective expectations. "We all want peace," she said. "We all want order. And sometimes that means making hard decisions." Then she presented her case complete with citations, timelines, and vague references to neighborhood unrest. She never named Lydia, but no one in the room was fooled. It was not a case. It was an accusation cloaked in administrative language. Eleanor didn't speak until she was invited. When she did, it was not with passion, but with clarity. She rose from her chair and began by reading directly from county statutes concerning the limits of residential committees, focusing on due process, equal treatment, and the inadmissibility of retroactive punitive frameworks. She stated plainly that the proposed vote had no legal standing, that it bordered on harassment, and that several documents previously distributed to residents could constitute civil defamation. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't attack. She simply dismantled the foundation Karen had built, one clause at a time. When she sat down, the room was silent. Karen tried to recover, citing neighborhood unity, but the spell had broken. Several residents raised their hands. One after another they spoke. Not loudly, but deliberately. "I've lived here 10 years and never seen anything like this," said one. "We're not a court. We're not law enforcement. We're neighbors," said another. One woman, older, soft-spoken, said, "If this is what community becomes, I'm ashamed to be part of it." The vote, when it finally came, wasn't close. The policy was rejected. Officially, it was recorded as a community non-adoption due to legal ambiguity. Unofficially, it was a collapse. Karen sat stiffly, her fingers clenched around the edges of her folder. When it was over, she stood, nodded to no one in particular, and walked out of the room without another word. Not even a glance at Lydia. Lydia didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply collected her things and followed Eleanor out into the night air. Outside, neighbors loitered awkwardly in small clusters, like people recovering from a tremor they hadn't realized was coming. A few nodded to Lydia. One man said, "You handled that better than I could have." She thanked him, but only quietly, then walked to her car and sat with the engine off, letting herself breathe. It wasn't victory, it wasn't vindication, it was release. And sometimes that was enough. The following weeks passed not with celebration, but with a slow exhale that seemed to settle across the neighborhood like the soft hush after a long storm. The vote had been struck down, the policy dismantled before it could become precedent, and the accusations laid bare for what they truly were: a series of veiled, deliberate attempts to isolate and expel someone who simply refused to conform to the whims of control. But the aftermath wasn't dramatic. No apology was issued, no statement from Karen acknowledging the result. The committee meetings quietly resumed with less attendance and fewer names attached to the memos. A subtle shift had occurred, the kind that couldn't be measured by headlines or confrontation, but by how often people looked you in the eye, or how long it took for silence to stop feeling like surveillance. Lydia didn't revel in it. She didn't suddenly become a regular at the social gatherings or start inserting herself into block-wide decisions. Her presence didn't transform, but it stabilized. The sideways glances stopped. Conversations became simpler, no longer weighted by subtext or avoidance. And for the first time since she'd moved into the house her brother left her, Lydia began to feel like she wasn't walking on a battlefield disguised as a cul-de-sac. She resumed her walks in the early morning, a cup of coffee in hand, and noticed how the quiet no longer felt heavy. The mailbox, once a source of tension, returned to its intended function, no longer stuffed with passive-aggressive flyers or warnings dressed up as guidance. Karen, for her part, did not disappear entirely, but her presence changed. The flyers stopped. Her self-appointed patrols became less frequent, and her voice, once the loudest at every gathering, was noticeably absent from any meaningful debate. A few people still clung to her orbit, those who had aligned themselves too publicly to walk back without embarrassment, but even they began to move with the hesitation of people uncertain about the ground they once stood on. Whatever power Karen had held wasn't taken from her. It had simply stopped being acknowledged, and in a place like Sycamore Ridge, that was the same as exile. Nick came by the following month for dinner, off duty, dressed casually for the first time in weeks. He sat across from Lydia at the kitchen table, the same one they'd eaten takeout on during the height of everything, but the air between them felt different now. Less braced, more grounded. Over grilled chicken and fresh greens, he finally asked, "So, does it feel like home yet?" Lydia didn't answer right away. She looked out the window where the streetlights bathed the sidewalk in amber, and a dog barked somewhere in the distance. Not an alarm, but just because it could. "It feels like a place I don't have to leave," she said finally, and that was enough. The folders remained in the drawer, organized, documented, complete. She didn't shred them, didn't forget, but they were no longer tools of defense. They were simply records, reminders of what had been endured and what wouldn't be repeated. Eleanor had advised her to keep everything for at least a year, and Lydia had no plans to discard any of it sooner. Just because the storm passed didn't mean the roof stopped needing maintenance. The committee eventually rotated leadership. Karen did not renominate herself. A quiet vote took place, overseen by residents who had once been passive but were now visibly engaged. The new chairperson, an understated woman named Felice, who had previously avoided all direct committee involvement, was elected without opposition. Her first act was to propose a transparency update to meeting procedures. Her second was to publicly state that no disciplinary actions against any resident would ever be based on subjective interpretations of behavior again. It wasn't framed as a rebuke, but it was. Lydia didn't attend that meeting. She didn't need to. She read the minutes in the comfort of her living room, the same room where she had once stood, wondering whether this house would become a prison or a haven. The place felt lighter now, not because everything was perfect, but because she no longer had to brace herself every time the doorbell rang or a car slowed in front of her house. She planted flowers beneath the front windows, not because anyone else cared how her yard looked, but because she did. She cleared out the garage, reorganized the boxes, and finally parked her car inside. Not to avoid scrutiny, but because the space had finally been reclaimed. And slowly, things simply returned. Not to what they were, but to something better than what they had been. Conversations with neighbors became authentic, no longer laced with suspicion. An invitation arrived for a neighborhood cookout, this time with Lydia's name handwritten rather than her address scrawled on a generic label. She attended. She stayed an hour. No one asked her to justify herself. No one mentioned the past, and when she left, someone actually said, "Hope to see you next time." It wasn't much, but it mattered. The house didn't feel like her brother's anymore. It didn't feel like a stranger's burden. It felt like a choice, one she could live with, one she could grow in. The war was over, not won, not lost, but survived. And for Lydia Marlowe, survival was victory enough.